Ed Conner. Ed joined the Johns Hopkins Neuroscience Department in 1996. He has served as director of the Krieger Mind-Brain Institute since 2007. Dr. Conner's research focuses on neural mechanisms underlying object vision. His work has shown how object structure is represented by a population of neurons in high-level visual regions of the brain, which provide the fundamental neurobasics for shape aesthetics.
Absolutely. So first, I want to congratulate you all on your fortitude in sticking it out to the last talk. I appreciate it. So one of the major roadblocks for applying neuroscience to architecture and other creative aesthetic fields is this. How do you control the causal factors that might influence aesthetic experiences? So Anjan talked about how experimental neuroscience is a matter of being able to control causes and look at how they change effects, in this case, aesthetic effects. To do that, you have to be able to vary causal factors so that you can analyze how they change effects. But that's hard to do in creative fields. So these sculptures by Jean Arp are one-offs. You can't change them easily or legally. So how do you define the factors that determine whether they're aesthetic? And even if you do, how can you vary those factors to measure their aesthetic effects? You can see that most of the studies that have been talked about today struggle with the fact that the stimuli are restricted to things that pre-exist. So I will talk today quickly about an approach that we take, which is to computerize or virtualize aesthetic objects so that we can then measure and manipulate things about them. We includes graduate students, Nirja Balakandar, Stephen Zachary, and also Gary Vikan, who's been mentioned before today, the former director of the Walters Art Museum. So we used a laser scanning device shown here to get 3D computer representations of Arp sculptures. Here's an example borrowed from the Baltimore Museum of Art. This is Arp's Leaf of the Pyramid, and here's a computer rendering. We have the entire 3D shape. You can see 3D here by virtue of shading, but also in our experiments, we used slightly different right and left eye images to give a real stereoscopic perspective. So having a computerized version allowed us to manipulate the sculptures in ways that are not usually possible. So here's an array of morphed versions of this sculpture right here. It's called Woman of Delos. And so just look at this array for a second and mentally pick out which version of the sculpture you like best. So how many people picked something in the upper right-hand quadrant here? A couple. How many people picked something in the lower left-hand quadrant? So most of you. It's a very reliable result for a majority of people. People obviously can have different aesthetic opinions, but this is one where most people agree, and their preference, of course, I could have influenced you here by having shown you Woman of Delos to begin with. The original sculpture is actually not shown in this array, but it's closer to that end. And let's do one more. Again, quickly look across this array, see what you like best. Anybody pick something in the lower right here? A couple. How about the lower left? Lots. How about the upper left? Some people. So this is what we actually did in experiments on many subjects in the laboratory and also at the Walters Art Museum. And what I'm going to show you now is how we analyzed the results. So the first thing we did was for each point in the array, for each of these stimuli, we counted up the number of subjects that picked that as their preferred shape, and That allows us to produce this graph here where we just use brightness to indicate average preference. And for these variations on leaf of the pyramid, most people liked something in this corner here, and you can see that. We also asked people to tell us about their least favorite. Some people pick things up in this corner, you can see. Some people pick things down in this corner, and you can see that. So then we use different geometric measures of three-dimensional shape to try to determine what was special about the preferred shapes, what was special about the anti-preferred shapes that was driving people's aesthetic judgments. And I don't have time to tell you about everything we examined, but what turned out to be highly relevant in this study, at least in our experiments on an admittedly limited number of stimuli, was surface curvature. So surface curvature, 3D surface curvature, is described in terms of two cross-sectional curvatures, the maximum and minimum cross-sectional curvature. So for this surface right here, the maximum cross-sectional curvature is shown in red, maximum in the sense that it's the most convex, it sticks out the most, it's the sharpest convex thing. And then the minimum curvature, which geometrically is always guaranteed to be orthogonal, is in this direction. And that the curvature here is 0, it's flat. So curvature for us runs from positive numbers, convex, through 0, that's flat, to negative numbers, that's concave. And in fact, this is our curvature axis here, sharp convex, broad convex, flat, broad concave, sharp concave. So what we did was to take lots of measurements across the entire surface of this shape. You may remember that this was the more preferred shape in the array that I showed you for the leaf of the pyramids sculpture. And for each of those points, we plot their maximum cross-sectional curvature on this axis, their minimum cross-sectional curvature on this axis. This is what we get. Then we do the same thing for all of the shapes in the array. We take the and we get this average. So these are all the sorts of points that appeared on the different versions of leaf of the pyramids. And then we take this array and we subtract this array to get the difference. So this difference shows us what was special about this sculpture in relation to all the other sculptures that we showed. And what's special, shown on the scale that tops out at dark red and goes through yellow down into blue, is that there are lots of points in this range where the maximum curvature is broad convex and the minimum curvature is pretty flat, more or less like here, more or less like most of the points along here. That is sort of broad convex cylindrical curvature. So then we do that for all the shapes in the array. Let's see. Right. So we do that for all the shapes in the array, and we get an average of preferred points shown in red, and we also do the same thing for anti-preferred points. So the preferred points, again, are in this range of broad cylindrical curvature. The anti-preferred points are narrow cylindrical curvature in cases like this, and really sharp convex points up in this corner of the curvature space. So then we do the same analysis across lots of different sculptures, lots of different arrays that we've applied to, that we've shown to lots of subjects. And this, again, was the average preference array that we got for leaf of the pyramids. We took that for all of our arrays, and we averaged to get this. So this represents preference in 3D curvature space across all of the sculptures, all the arrays we studied. The important thing is that you've got strong preference in this region right here, which again corresponds to broad cylindrical curvature. And in this region right here, I know it's very close, but it's more along this axis here, which represents bumps that are convex in both directions. And these represent very smooth bumps, the sort of smooth terminations that you saw at the end of Woman of Delos, for example. The anti-preferred parts of 3D curvature space, in contrast, in this set at least, was narrow cylindrical curvature over here and really sharp convex points way up here. And here's the Woman of Delos array again. And here in this generally preferred region, you can see that you've got the broad cylindrical curvature and the relatively blunt convex points. So at this point, we've identified a region in surface curvature space that most people prefer, something we can quantify. And a region that also corresponds to what Art tended to concentrate on in his sculptures. So now can we use this to do some neuroaesthetics? Can we explain why people prefer that region in terms of neural processing in the brain? So to do that, we used fMRI to measure responses to these shapes in regions that process objects, shown on an inflated brain here, and you've seen some of this, basically parts of occipital and inferior temporal cortex. We used extremes of our array, ranging from the broad curvature that people liked to the sharp cylindrical and pointy curvature that people didn't like. For each of these shapes, we did the same kind of plot that you've seen before. We sample all their points. We find the distribution of those points in surface curvature space. This one is in the preferred range. This one in the non-preferred ranges here and here. And now, instead of doing a preference-weighted average of these things, we're going to do a brain response-weighted average. So we're looking at the part of the brain that represents objects. We're going to weight this plot here by the average response across multiple subjects to this stimulus here. We'll do that for this plot, for this plot, for this plot, and we'll create a weighted average of all of them. And that's what we have here, the response weighted average of these four plots. And in fact, the largest response was to this stimulus here, which would be the most preferred stimulus, so that you can see that this response weighted average mainly reflects the surface curvatures seen in there. We do that for lots of different sculptures, lots of different arrays, and here's what we get. And you can see once again that in this plot that represents average responsiveness of these object-sensitive brain regions to different kinds of surface curvatures, there's strong responses to broad cylindrical curvature right here. There's strong responses to blunt convex terminations up here, weak responses to narrow cylindrical curvature, weak responses to really sharp convex points, which is strikingly similar to the preference pattern that we saw. So here's what I just showed you for fMRI. Here's our preference pattern average across everything. And again, you can see high responses, high preference for broad cylindrical curvature, and for blunt convex bumps. Surprisingly, this is visible at the level of individual subjects as well, not usually true in fMRI. So we've got agreement between perceptual preference and neural responses. In this case, at least, stimuli that evoke stronger responses are preferred, suggesting what could be a more general principle about how strength of neural representation relates to aesthetics. Doesn't have to be that way, might not be that way in other experiments. You could hypothesize that stimuli that evoke more responses would be obnoxious, like loud noises. You can imagine preferring stimuli that whisper to the cortex. It's striking that the most preferred smell that anybody has ever discovered doesn't apparently activate any olfactory receptors. You could also imagine preferring stimuli that just activate a subset of cells that could be appealing in the same way as Christmas lights at night. But this result makes sense in, that is, more appeal to stronger responses in that visual cortex is an information gathering system. It's hungry for information. It's constantly processing information. These are stimuli that give it more of the information that it evolved to process. But this begs a further question. Why did visual cortex evolve to process this kind of information? So I don't have a scientific answer for that. I'm not sure there could be, but it's fun to speculate about. Broad convex curvature of this kind is characteristic of inflated membranes, membranes that are under internal pressure, which in our world are usually biological objects. Biological objects are the most informationally critical things in our environment. Fruit that we eat, prey that we hunt, predators we need to escape, conspecifics who could be friends or mates or enemies. All of these objects are characterized by broad, smooth, convex curvature. In contrast, inorganic objects like rocks, which maybe are less interesting, tend to have more jagged surfaces with random planes and edges. So really quickly, all of this has been about objects. This audience is more interested in large-scale structure. Do the same principles apply? So in this scene, many of the biological and constructed objects exemplify broad convex curvature, but the large-scale structure of the street, the sidewalk, the buildings is instead extremely rectilinear, made up of planes and sharp edges with lots of extra sharp edges to amplify that rectilinearity. So we haven't done comparable experiments on preference for surface curvature in large-scale shape, but we have done neural experiments that are at least suggestive. These are neural experiments using electrical recording from monkeys that are viewing stimuli on a screen. And what we found was that in the anterior temporal part of cortex, which is the monkey homologue for the human regions that we were looking at, in the topmost channel of temporal cortex, we got exactly what we expected when we showed stimuli that ranged from small objects to really large environments. Cells typically responded most strongly to small object-like stimuli. So these are the highest response stimuli that evolved in an adaptive experiment in two different lineages. But surprisingly, this middle channel here on the lateral surface of the brain, most of the cells don't respond best to objects. They respond much more strongly to very large environments that look like landscapes or room interiors. So that's one place that you could study responses to environments that potentially relate to objects, since it's part of a generally object-sensitive cortex. And here's the teaser that I'll leave with you. I've already showed you that object-sensitive cells respond more strongly to these broad convex curvatures. So that's not true for these environment-sensitive cells at all. So this, and I apologize, this plot is flipped relative to the last one, but this shows, with yellow being the top of the scale, averaged over many cells that respond to really large-scale environments, which kinds of surface curvatures they respond to really well. So this is the range that drove things so well with object cortex. Here, instead, the strongest responses are to really flat planes or to long, extended, sharp edges, or to long, extended, sharp corners, the sort of thing you see between the walls and the ceilings. So you could speculate very wildly before actually doing the experiments that this suggests that With objects, there's a preference for a certain type of surface curvature. For large-scale environments, buildings that we construct, there may be a natural preference for rectilinearity. So when I look at this room, I'm actually struck by the rectilinearity. John used it as an example for curvature. And of course, aesthetics is much more complex than that. But anyway, thanks for your attention.